Have an update on the Point Defiance Bypass Rail Project from Ron Pate, the Program Director, and Larry Mattson, Environmental Manager of the Washington State Department of Transportation. Please step up to the mic, introduce yourself, and hopefully our computer system's working the first time this time.
I'm Ron Pate from the Department of Transportation. I am the Program Manager for the High Speed Rail Program. Deputy Mayor Anderson and Council, thank you for having us tonight to give you a status update on the program. Tonight I brought with me Larry Mattson, who's our environmental expert, and Melanie Kuhn, who's our communications manager for the program. What I'd like to do tonight is, first off, I'm going to outline what we'd like to talk about. We're going to give a project status update. We're going to talk about alternatives. So we examined alternatives. Some of you may be familiar with that from our public outreach sessions that we went through. What alternatives were carried forward and which were removed from consideration. And then next steps, what's the next steps of the program. So we've had regular meetings, as a lot of you know, with our advisory teams. We've done actually more than that as well. We've also had a lot of meetings with neighborhood associations, meetings with community groups, and we continue to have meetings, and we'll continue to do that as we move through this process. We are still in the environmental assessment phase. That's very important to know. Decisions are still being made. We still have to work through mitigation processes. We'll have a lot of ongoing public outreach as we move through this process. One of the things I know we've heard from some of the community members is that they would like more direct input to us and to the program. And Larry will talk a little bit about mitigation options and how community members can directly have input to that. So with that said, I get the easy part tonight. I get to turn it over to Larry, since we are deeply involved in the NEPA process, and we want everyone to understand where we're at in the process and what opportunities and options there are.
Thanks, Ron. Good evening, Deputy Mayor and Council members. NEPA is the National Environmental Policy Act, and I know we can get waist deep in acronyms here, so hopefully this is the first and last time you'll hear me say NEPA or see one of our acronyms, but National Environmental Policy Act. I wanted to show you this image because this is the flow chart that I used last time we were here, and we were on box number 6. Lane, if you could click the next slide. So what we've done, basically we've moved a step down the ladder in the process, so we're in the phase of assessing the environmental effects of the project. Next slide. Thank you. I think I like this slide just a little bit better than the previous one because I think it shows better where we are, and we're kind of in this a transition, I think, between developing, evaluating, and screening our project alternatives and looking at the project impacts. And so the primary purpose of what I wanted to share with you tonight was where we are with the alternatives. Lakewood was one city in particular, as well as several of the others up and down the corridor, that asked us to look at alternatives to the the bypass route. So we have removed some alternatives from further consideration and have started analyzing the impacts of alternatives that we will carry forward. I'll go into those in detail in just a minute. Next slide. So the bypass project, I think it's important to give the community some context about where this came from. It's the result of nearly 20 years of planning, study, and investment in the Pacific Northwest Rail Corridor from Vancouver, British Columbia, down to Portland, Oregon, and as far south as Eugene, actually. Numerous planning documents, there's just 2 of them up here that we've shown, but culminating 2 years ago in the corridor environmental assessment, followed last year by the finding of no significant impact, which is what the FONSI acronym is up there. Also back in the 90s, the federal government designated the Pacific Northwest Rail Corridor as one of 5 high-speed passenger rail corridors in the U.S., and that was followed in 1992 by a high-speed ground transportation study, and the state legislature took action in 1993 and created the high-speed ground transportation program at Washington State Department of Transportation. Next slide. Thank you. So the Point Defiance Bypass project is one of 15 projects within the corridor from the Canadian border down to our Oregon border, and they all share 3 similar attributes, and that is the goal of reducing trip times, achieving greater schedule reliability, and offering additional trips to meet growing demand for passenger rail. Point Defiance Bypass Project is a key piece of that vision. So if we could go back to the other slide real quick. Thank you. One more. Yeah. So in the outcome of the 2010 finding of no significant impact, identified projects along the corridor. The next step in that was individual project environmental analyses. So that's what the environmental assessment is for Point Defiance Bypass. Some of the other projects north and south of here have lesser environmental review that's taken place or is ongoing. So what we do in that environmental analysis phase is look at a range of reasonable alternatives. That's what we're required to do under the National Environmental Policy Act. Next slide. And one more.
Excuse me, could you back up to the slide you just...
Sure.
What's the difference between an Amtrak train and a Washington train?
So you're looking at the key on that graph. We have Oregon trains, Amtrak, and Washington trains. Those are the trains operated by Washington State Department of Transportation.
For an example?
The Cascades. So the Amtrak Cascades trips are what we operate. Then there's the Coast Starlight, which is an Amtrak train. I know it's kind of splitting hairs, but we have the Coast Starlight, which is an Amtrak train, and then the Cascades, which is WashDOT. Correct?
Correct.
Yep. Okay.
They're all high speed, or at least quick passenger trains.
Yes. Okay. So an alternative under NEPA, it's basically a solution or a course of action in response to a defined problem. For the National Environmental Policy Act documents, the problem is defined in a project's purpose and need. And so if we go to the next slide, we can look at the purpose and need for the Point Defiance Bypass Project. The purpose and need of our project is about 3 paragraphs long. I tried to distill its core elements down here for you tonight, but basically, again, it's more frequent and reliable high-speed passenger rail service. It's the preference for existing transportation corridors over new, and that's basically an effort to minimize construction costs as well as environmental impacts. Because if we're pioneering a new route, that can displace communities, businesses, residences, rather than using an existing route like the American Lake Line, which is what the Point Defiance Bypass Project runs through, which has been in place since 1891 or so. Next slide. So how do we develop these alternatives? We gathered input from our technical advisory committee composed of staff from Lakewood, DuPont, Pierce County, Tacoma, JBLM, several federal highways, federal rail, as well as input from the citizens at some of the events we had held, particularly back in January at the Tillicum neighborhood. So the shoreline alternative was one recommendation that we look at in greater detail. And that's basically the existing route around Point Defiance. And we looked at what we called a greenfield alternative, and greenfield is just kind of a jargony term for a new alignment, basically. And there are 6 variations on that greenfield alternative. And we looked at the bypass itself and the no-build. The no-build is something that federal environmental rules require us to evaluate. Next slide, please. Oop. Councilwoman, yes. Impact zone on the drawing? Yeah. Yeah. So I don't know if the audience can see, but on the photograph that's to the right of the slide, there's in the middle, there's an impact zone drawn in magic marker. And it's at basically the southwest portion of Joint Base Lewis-McChord. Larry Mickle is our liaison, and he had mentioned that that's an artillery impact zone. And so probably not a good area to route new trains through. It's, right. Yeah. Yeah, artillery, hits the earth. That's the impact. Mm-hmm. So we screened these alternatives. There were several criteria we took into account. These are the three primary criteria. Does it meet the purpose and need? Is the alternative reasonable? And are there significant environmental impacts? So we asked those questions of each of the alternatives, and the results of those are in what we call the Greenfield Technical Memo, as well as the Shoreline Route Technical Memo. They are not memos by any stretch of the imagination. They are very long reports, but basically they're a preliminary alternatives analysis where we looked at each of those routes and looked at the social, economic, and environmental costs, as well as the construction costs of what it would take to build those routes. That is the shoreline route, as well as the greenfield alternatives. Next slide, please. So, alternatives removed from further consideration. Next slide. The shoreline alternative. So that's the existing route around Point Defiance. Some of the constraints there were, just to pull some of the figures, we've included a table in your packet. Hopefully you have that table, comparison of greenfield alternatives. So that's just for the greenfield alternatives. We have another table for the shoreline alternatives. But right-of-way acquisitions would be around the $30 million range to acquire the necessary right-of-way. One of the significant constraints for using this alignment would be the construction costs, which we pegged at over $1 billion. A lot of money, but what that is rolled up in is the structural cost. Basically, we would need to add a third main line along the shoreline there. We'd have to do a lot of earthwork, a lot of retaining walls, bridges, and of course a new tunnel. And anytime you tunnel, the risks of your project increase a lot. And how we factor in risk at WashDOT is usually escalate the cost of something to account for that risk. So,
Did the engineering alternatives for the shoreline alternative include an evaluation of using the existing two lines and lowering the floor of the tunnel to reconfigure it as a two-track tunnel?
no, did not. Lowering the floor of the Ruston Tunnel?
Well, one of the leading tunnel reconfiguration engineering firms in the country is in Washington State, and they've redesigned the roof of tunnels to make clearance, and I understand that this tunnel is not a candidate for that, but another alternative is to lower the floor because the tunnel is wide enough for two tracks. It was just reconfigured to a one-track tunnel to give greater clearance for stacked containers. And I was wondering if any evaluation of lowering the floor, the couple of feet necessary to provide that clearance had been made.
No, we looked at just the cost to upgrade it to accommodate, I believe, two tracks through there at a slightly wider configuration than is currently to allow for more shy, I guess is the technical term, distance between passing trains.
If I may interject, I think from that question being raised at the Executive Advisory Committee, my understanding is that the cost prohibitive nature of these numbers is that the proposal was for a new tunnel somewhere in the vicinity of the existing tunnel, and I believe I was told that the reason for that was that to try to make adjustments to the existing tunnel because of its age appeared to be problematic from a risk standpoint in terms of losing the whole thing. It goes through the north end of Tacoma, of course, underneath hundreds or thousands of people's property. So I believe I was told that was the reason for an alternative tunnel being analyzed, or a second tunnel as part of this alternative. And I know Mr. Pate is here too, maybe he can confirm that, but I know that was discussed.
That was my understanding as to modification to the top of the tunnel, which was risky, but my question was whether the alternative of lowering the floor of the tunnel and not modifying the top of the tunnel.
I don't think we did engineering analysis on lowering the floor, but I agree with Mr. Knightis. And I do know that if you lower, we looked at, when some of the conceptual grade separations, we looked at lowering tracks. Well, you also have to take into account the grade of the track and trains and freight trains being able to move over that track. Steep grades are somewhat problematic, as we know, down by the D to M Street project. Also, I think our goal was with a single track structure with a bottleneck in there still, even though container traffic, or if you get two stacked passenger trains, that may help lowering it, but it doesn't give us the pass-by capacity needed to make the performance outcomes, was my understanding. If you even raised it to get bigger trains through, we still wouldn't have that ability to pass back and forth, and we'd have possibly a bottleneck.
Well, it was for most of its lifetime, the tunnel was a two-track tunnel.
It was a two-track tunnel, and I think and I'd have to look at this, I'm talking off the top of my head here, but I think with ARIMA standards, I don't think the capacity with a passenger train and a freight train could pass in that tunnel today with the design of trains and the design of the structure. And I do know they did look at raising the roof of it as well. But we can certainly follow up and get you more information.
So real quick, the environmental concerns, two things I wanted to point out there. 4F property impacts, Section 4F of the Transportation Act from back in the 1960s. Basically, it protects wildlife refuges, historic properties, parks, and a fourth category, I believe, other places that aren't specific properties listed on the historic register. But what 4F tells us as environmental professionals is if you have an alternative that avoids impacting a protected 4F property, you must use that alternative. So we have impacts to 4F properties. There are several parks that we would impact. Titlow Beach, I believe, as well as the Nisqually Wildlife Refuge. So there are alternatives that avoid impacts to the 4F properties, the Point Defiance bypass being one of those. And the other is that there'd be 2.5 miles of shoreline fill to improve the shoreline alternative. And I've worked with fill permits, and that would take us a long time to get approval, if we were to get approval for that much shoreline fill. And then to mitigate for that would be substantial as well. Next slide. The greenfield alternative, so you do have this table with you. There were 6 variations on the greenfield alternative. They're shown on the multicolor map here. We got real creative with our marking pens one day during the technical group meeting. We looked at some routes. We looked at the I-5 median as a possibility. But as you can see from the map, most of the routes were south and east of I-5. And again, there's 3 routes that are shown going through the Nisqually Indian Reservation, as well as the south end of JBLM, and that would be problematic because both of those groups would need to approve this, approve a new alignment, a new rail alignment through their properties. And there were 4F impacts as well for these greenfield alternatives, which was another reason that steered us back to the Point Defiance bypass route. Next slide. So the alternatives carried forward into the environmental assessment. We have the Point Defiance bypass, our proposed action, and then the no action or the no build alternative, which I mentioned we're required to carry forward under the National Environmental Policy Act. Basically, that alternative is maintenance, ongoing maintenance and that sort of thing, but it doesn't cover any type of capital improvement to improve efficiency or anything like that in the rail line. Next steps, or next slide, please. So upcoming opportunities for input. We're going to have an open house at Clover Park Technical College, August 31st. We have flyers out here on the desk outside the chambers. Our major discipline reports are being drafted currently, and they'll be out, they'll be sent to the local jurisdictions very shortly. The transportation report will be reviewed in October, and noise and vibration, as well as our social elements report in November. Those will be sessions that basically take a half day. We'll get all of the local jurisdictions around the table, so they can all hear the questions they're asking of us and our consultants, and everyone can hear the same answers. And the environmental assessment itself will come out in the fall of 2012. And one thing that's not up here that is definitely worth mentioning is the idea of a neighborhood mitigation workshop. We've heard from you as well as other communities along the corridor, when can the public have a direct opportunity to have a say on how this project might look? And so January, February of next year, the report should be done. We'll know what our impacts are. Those reports will have mitigation measures identified. So we'll have some of the mitigation measures up on the wall. We'll invite the neighborhoods to come out, take a look at those, propose new ideas that may not be up on the wall, that may not have been proposed. And just one example would be safety. We hear a lot about safety, the safety of children, the Clover Park schools that adjoin the bypass route. And especially in the Tillicum neighborhood, which is landlocked, there is no way for children, or adults for that matter, to walk to Lakewood without going along the railroad right away or along I-5, neither of which are safe options. So perhaps a bicycle pedestrian trail that links Tillicum to Lakewood would be an appropriate mitigation measure. That's an idea, but we need to hear from the community as to whether that makes sense or not. So with that, I'd be happy to entertain any questions. Ron and I are both available.
Mr. Whalen.
One of the questions I had in terms of the consideration of the alternatives, which seems to be focused on the bypass route, looking at the balancing act between safety and reliability and efficiency for the railroad, or for the Amtrak route, it seems to me that one of the concerning things for the community has been to receive all of the burden but very little of the benefit. And one thought might be to look at the alternative of actually stopping at Lakewood Station, which provides some potential benefit to the community and lessens the burden and perhaps enhances the safety with the train at the peak speed of 79 coming from Tacoma heading southbound. At least if there's a stop, it slows along the corridor, in my humble opinion, and perhaps provides some benefit to the community. And I know you've heard, an earful from the community about, no way, no how, but it seems to me that that should be at least an alternative that is looked at, because to date I've heard there's been no plan to stop at Lakewood Station. Mm-hmm. To me, it exists. It's already there. We're planning a pedestrian overpass from another portion of the city to the Lakewood Station. It provides some benefit rather than all of the burden, if that is an option that's looked at a little bit more carefully.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. We'll include an evaluation of that in the environmental assessment. I do know that came up last time we were here, and David Smelzer addressed it. I can say a barrier to doing so at this time would be our service outcomes, the objectives we hope to achieve, station-to-station travel times, Olympia to Tacoma. So if there's an interim stop in Lakewood, DuPont, for that matter, then that affects times all up and down the chain. But you've suggested it's a good idea. We'll include that in the analysis.
Certainly, because we're balancing some outcomes, whether it's service versus safety. Yeah. So that may be an opportunity there to give and take a bit.
Yeah.
Anstetter.
Do you have that?
Here he is.
Oh, there it is.
On this slide, under environmental concerns, you list JBLM and the Squally tribe approvals as a reason why this particular alternative is not one factor that makes it unfavorable. And I guess that this sort of implies that these two particular agencies have some level of having to approve something, whereas in the bypass where we're dealing with Tacoma, Lakewood, and DuPont, that because we don't seem to have any real approval role, that just makes us a more inviting route to be able to go and do that. And I don't particularly relish saying that, you know, if the law just gave us as a jurisdiction more of a voice, that would carry greater credence, as this seems to imply. I mean, in your consideration of between the no build and the point defiance process, what level of environmental concern that the fact that there are jurisdictions along that route that at least have views, whether they have the legal right to make approvals, is a consideration in that sort of an environmental evaluation?
Absolutely. The intent of that bullet, JBLM and Nisqually tribe approvals, was to illustrate that in the hierarchy of federal, state, local, those are both federal. Tribes being an equivalent sovereign government to federally recognized tribes anyway. So you've got the military as a federal entity, federally recognized tribes as another federal entity. So in the hierarchy, the food chain that we all deal with on a political reality basis, they're at the top. That's the only point. It doesn't mean that Tacoma, Lakewood, DuPont's concerns are any less valid. That's not the intent. No.
Any other questions from council? Well, I thank you for your presentation. It's informative, and we're sure there will be more.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you.